The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which Meredith Ashton would later think was the cruelest part of it. Not a Monday, when bad news might have felt like the natural weight of the week returning. A Tuesday. Ordinary. Unremarkable. The kind of day when nothing is supposed to happen. She had been in the kitchen of the lodging house on Garnet Street, helping Mrs. Penhaligon peel turnips, because the girl who usually came on Tuesdays had not, and Meredith had learned in the 14 months since her father's death that idle hands in a cold room were simply cold hands. The letter was brought by a boy she did not recognize. He handed it to her, not to Mrs. Penhaligon, which meant someone knew where she was. That alone made her stomach turn before she had broken the seal. The seal was her cousin Rawdon's. She recognized the pressed griffin, the same device that had once been stamped into the wax on every piece of correspondence that left Thornfield Grange. The estate that had been hers, the estate that was now his. She read the letter standing in the kitchen doorway with the November wind coming in around her ankles. Rawdon Ashton was writing to inform her, in the careful, bloodless language of a man who had paid solicitors a great deal of money to compose 3 paragraphs, that he had sold Thornfield Grange. Not the land, not the tenants' leases. The house itself, the contents, the grounds, the glass houses, the dower cottage, and everything within a quarter mile of the front gate. Sold it to settle the debts he had accumulated in the 2 years since her father had died, and left everything, every last acre and teaspoon, to a male heir who turned out to have no particular talent for keeping things. The buyer's name was given in the final line of the letter, almost as an afterthought, the Duke of Carworth. Meredith read the name twice. She had heard of him. Anyone in the north of England who followed the movements of land and money had heard of him. Gideon Ashford, 4th Duke of Carworth, who owned more of Northumberland than was comfortable to think about, who had rebuilt 3 crumbling estates in a decade, who was said to be cold-blooded in negotiation and absolute in his expectations. He was 36 or 38, depending on which account you believed. He had not married. He did not attend the season. He was, by all reports, a man who acquired things and kept them and did not feel the need to explain himself to anyone. He had acquired Thornfield Grange. Meredith put the letter in her pocket and went back to the turnips. She did not decide all at once. That was the thing she would remember later, when she tried to make sense of it. There was no single moment of resolution, no midnight clarity, no brave declaration to her reflection in Mrs. Penhaligon's spotted mirror. It came in pieces over 4 days, the way a plan does when you are not quite willing to admit to yourself that it is a plan. On the first day she thought about the glass houses. Her mother had spent 15 years cultivating those glass houses. Camellias and jasmine and a particular variety of rose she had brought back from a visit to her sister in Edinburgh. Pale, pink, and smaller than most, with a scent that Meredith associated entirely with her mother's skirts. When her mother died, Meredith had kept them. She had learned from the head gardener, a quiet Northumbrian man named Tully, how to take cuttings and manage the temperature in winter. The glass houses were not valuable in any financial sense, but they were hers, in a way that a solicitor's letter could not quite reach. On the second day she thought about the housekeeper, Mrs. Crowe. Mrs. Crowe had been at Thornfield Grange since before Meredith was born. She was 61 years old and had arthritis in both hands, and had, in the particular way of housekeepers who outlast the families they serve, developed a loyalty that transferred badly. She had stayed on when Rawdon arrived. She had written to Meredith twice in the lodging house on Garnet Street, carefully worded letters that said nothing objectionable and communicated a great deal of distress. On the third day, Meredith sent a letter to Thornfield Grange. She addressed it not to Mrs. Crowe, but to the estate manager, a man named Fitch, who had been handling accounts since Rawdon's first creditor had appeared at the door. She said she was applying for the position of under housekeeper. She gave her name as Miss Meredith Grant. She said she came from Halifax and had worked in 2 houses and could provide a character reference from a Mrs. Alcott of Leeds, which was true, because Mrs. Alcott had been her mother's second cousin and had employed Meredith for 3 weeks the previous winter, when Meredith had briefly believed that honest work and distance from Thornfield would make her feel better about losing it. They had not, but the reference was real. On the 4th day the reply came. The Duke of Carworth was taking possession of the estate on the 15th of December. The household was being reorganized. An under-housekeeper was required. She was to present herself at the servants' entrance on the morning of the 12th. Meredith read this and thought, 3 days before he arrives. Enough time to understand what he has taken. She told herself that was all she wanted, to see it once more. To walk the rooms and the glass houses, and to say goodbye properly, in the way that Rawdon's letter had not permitted. She believed this, mostly, as she packed her single trunk. The servants' entrance of Thornfield Grange was on the east side of the house, past the old dairy, and around a stand of birch trees that had grown taller than she remembered. She had never used it in her life, which was, she supposed, the point. Everything looked smaller from this angle, and more worn and more real. The housekeeper who met her was not Mrs. Crowe. This woman was younger, perhaps 40, with a Scots accent and quick eyes, and the particular authority of someone recently appointed to a position she intended to hold. She introduced herself as Mrs. Drummond. She looked Meredith over with the practiced assessment of a woman who had interviewed a great many applicants and developed opinions about all of them. "Miss Grant," she said. "Yes," said Meredith, who had been Miss Grant for 4 days, and found it sat on her tongue like an ill-fitting button. "You'll take the linen cupboards first. They've been left in disorder. After that, I'll show you the silver room." Meredith followed her into the house. The smell hit her before anything else. Beeswax and coal smoke, and something faintly herbal from the kitchen corridor. The same smell it had always been, underneath all the change, unchanged by Rawdon or removal, or the Duke of Carworth's impending arrival. She breathed it in and looked straight ahead and did not let her face do anything that Mrs. Drummond might notice. The back hallways were familiar but foreign from below. She had walked these same corridors 100 times on her way to speak to cook or to check on something for her father, but always from the other side of the invisible line that divided those who owned a house from those who maintained it. Now she was on the working side, and the dimensions were different, and the light came from different windows, and she understood suddenly and completely that she had never actually known Thornfield Grange at all. She spent 3 hours sorting linen cupboards. It was dull, precise work, and she was grateful for it. Mrs. Crowe found her on the 2nd morning. Meredith had known it would happen eventually. Mrs. Crowe had been housekeeper for 30 years. There was nothing in the house she did not know about, including, apparently, the new under-housekeeper who moved through the east wing, as if she had grown up walking those floors. She came into the linen cupboard and closed the door behind her and stood looking at Meredith for a long moment. "Miss Meredith," she said very quietly. "Mrs. Crowe," said Meredith equally quietly. "I would ask you not to say anything. I had worked that out for myself." The old housekeeper sat down on the step-stool with the careful deliberateness of someone whose knees hurt. "Your father would be appalled." "My father," said Meredith, "left everything to Rawdon, so I have some difficulty accepting his authority on matters of dignity." Mrs. Crowe was quiet for a moment. "Rawdon left 3 weeks ago. He took the carriage horses and the good wine from the cellar, and one of the footmen who he apparently owed money to, and then offered a position instead. He did not say goodbye to anyone." This was not surprising. Rawdon had never said goodbye to anyone in his life, including Meredith, when he had written to tell her that the house was sold. "What is the Duke like?" Meredith asked. Mrs. Crowe seemed to consider the question carefully. "I haven't met him. His man came last week, a Mr. Hadley, very correct, very particular. He made a list of everything in every room. He said His Grace had specific intentions for the estate. He didn't say what they were, intentions. He's not selling it on. That's what Fitch thinks. Hadley asked too many questions about the tenants and the drainage on the north field for someone intending to turn it over. He's keeping it." Meredith thought about this. Keeping it. Gideon Ashford, the fourth Duke of Carworth, who already had 3 houses and more land than he could personally stand on, was keeping Thornfield Grange. Not as an investment, not as a short hold, keeping it the way her father had kept it, the way her grandfather had kept it, because it was the kind of place that was worth keeping. She found that she resented this rather less than she expected to. She also found that it complicated her plan considerably, because her plan, to the extent that she had one, had been built on the assumption that the Duke was the sort of man who purchased houses carelessly, and that kind of man was easy to despise. A man who kept things was harder. "I'll be careful," she told Mrs. Crowe. "You'd better be," said Mrs. Crowe, "because he arrives tomorrow morning, and I have it on good authority that he notices everything." He arrived at 9:30. Meredith was in the entrance hall, carrying a basket of dried lavender that Mrs. Drummond had sent her to place in the guest rooms, which was the sort of task that put her in exactly the wrong part of the house, at exactly the wrong moment. She heard the carriage on the drive and had approximately 30 seconds to decide whether to go up the back stairs or carry on as though she had every right to be exactly where she was. She carried on. The Duke of Carworth came through the front door with the controlled purposefulness of a man who had learned long ago that hesitation in a doorway was read as uncertainty, and he did not do uncertainty. He was taller than she had imagined, and less polished. Not rough, nothing like rough, but there was a quality to him that was more plain than his title suggested. Dark coat, no ornamentation, eyes that moved over the entrance hall with the quick, absorbing attention of someone cataloging. They landed on her. She kept walking. Basket, lavender, under housekeeper on an errand. Nothing remarkable. "You." His voice was not particularly loud, but it carried without effort. "Stop a moment," she stopped. "You're new," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, Your Grace, Miss Grant. Under housekeeper." She looked at a point slightly past his shoulder, which was what one did, which was what she had learned in the 14 months of learning what one did. He looked at her for a moment in a way that was not impolite but was very thorough. "Where are you going with that?" "Guest rooms, Your Grace. Mrs. Drummond's instructions." He nodded, a single precise movement, and turned toward the main staircase where Fitch was waiting to walk him through the estate accounts. Meredith went to the guest rooms. Her hands, she noticed, were entirely steady. She considered this either a good sign or an alarming one. In the days that followed, she learned the shape of him the way you learn the weather of a place, by observation, by pattern, by the particular quality of quiet that preceded certain moods. He was methodical. He walked every part of the estate in the first 3 days, not with a steward pointing things out, but alone, in his working coat, going slowly along the fence lines, and through the kitchen garden, and across the north field where the drainage was poor. He asked questions of the tenants directly, which they were not accustomed to, and initially did not know how to respond to. He gave instructions that were clear and did not require repetition. He was not warm, exactly, but he was fair in a way that was immediately legible, and the staff, Meredith noticed, responded to fairness with a reliability that they had not extended to Rawdon in 2 years of service. She avoided him when she could. When she could not, she was Miss Grant, with the basket or the polishing cloth or the household ledger for Mrs. Drummond. He spoke to her occasionally, briefly, about practical things. He was not dismissive. He was not overly familiar. He was, she thought, simply a man who existed at a remove from people he had not yet chosen to be near. She understood this. She had lived at a remove herself, since her father's death, since the letter. She recognized the shape of it. What she had not expected was the glass houses. She had gone on the 5th morning, early, before the household was properly moving, because she could not stay away any longer. The camellias were in reasonable condition. Someone had watered them. The rose her mother had brought from Edinburgh. She found it in the far corner, past the jasmine, and stood in front of it for a moment, with her throat doing something she had to consciously suppress. They were here when I arrived. She turned. The Duke was standing in the doorway of the glass house, with a cup of something hot. Coffee, she thought, and an expression that was not quite curiosity. He was looking at the rose. The camellia was grafted at some point, he said. Unusual technique. Someone knew what they were doing. The head gardener, Meredith said before she could stop herself. Tully, he's been here since. She stopped. He looked at her. Since before my employment, she said. A pause. He was still looking at her. Not the way people looked at under-housekeepers, which was mostly not at all, but with the same careful attention he had given the entrance hall on the first morning. Reading the room. The rose, he said. Do you know what variety it is? It's called Maiden's Promise, she said. It came from Edinburgh originally. How do you know that? Mrs. Crowe mentioned it, she said, and hated herself slightly for using Mrs. Crowe as a shield. He nodded slowly and drank his coffee and looked at the roses and did not say anything further. After a moment, Meredith excused herself and went back to the house. She sat in the linen cupboard for 10 minutes with her hands in her lap and thought, he knows something is not right. He may not know what, but he knows. The solicitor arrived on the 4th day. His name was Prescott, and he was not from the Duke's firm. He was from Rawdon's former firm, which Meredith recognized with a cold dropping sensation, and he came in a hired carriage and asked to speak to the master of the house, which Fitch relayed to the Duke, who received him in the study. Meredith learned what happened in that meeting in 3 stages over the following hours, in the incremental way that information moves through a household. The first stage was Mrs. Drummond, who had heard raised voices and reported this to Mrs. Crowe with an air of professional concern. The second stage was Mrs. Crowe, who had positioned herself near the study door on the grounds of arranging a flower display in the adjacent hall. She was 61, and her knees hurt, and she had stood there for 20 minutes, which told Meredith something about the severity of her concern. The third stage was Mrs. Crowe herself, who came to find Meredith in the silver room and closed the door. Rawdon, said Mrs. Crowe, had debts that have not been accounted for. Meredith set down the piece of silver she was holding. How much? More than the sale of the house covered. Prescott is claiming that there are assets that were not included in the sale, that Rawdon had promised as collateral before he settled on selling to the Duke. She paused. He mentioned a trust. Meredith went very still. There was a trust. Her grandfather had established it for the female heirs of Thornfield, because her grandfather had been an unusual man for his time. Not progressive exactly, but possessed of a specific distrust of sons-in-law and nephews that he had formalized in legal language. The trust was not large, but it had been Meredith's properly and legally regardless of what happened to the estate itself. Rawdon had promised it as collateral. He can't, she said. It was not his to promise. No, said Mrs. Crowe, but Prescott has documentation. And Rawdon is in Edinburgh. What does the Duke say? Mrs. Crowe hesitated. He said he needed to review the documents. He was not angry exactly, very quiet. You know how some men are quiet in a way that's worse than shouting. Meredith knew exactly how that was. She sat for a long time after Mrs. Crowe left. She thought about the trust, the specific, legal. irrevocable fact of it, her grandfather's precise language, the way it had existed quietly in the background of her dispossession as the one thing that was still hers, and how Rawdon had apparently attempted to reach even that. She thought about going to the Duke, not as Miss Grant, under housekeeper, as herself. She had known this might come. She had told herself, in the cold kitchen on Garnet Street, that all she wanted was to see the house once more. She had half believed it, but there was a difference between telling yourself the story and believing it completely. And somewhere in the past week, in the glass house with the Edinburgh rose and the early mornings in the rooms she had grown up in, she had stopped believing it entirely. She was not here to say goodbye. She had never been here to say goodbye. She was here because the house was hers, and she did not know what to do about that except to be in it. She knocked on the study door at 8 in the evening. He was at the desk with Prescott's documents spread in front of him and a lamp angled to illuminate the edges of the pages. He looked up when she came in, and something in his expression shifted. Not surprise exactly, but a realignment, the same look he'd had in the glass house. "Miss Grant," he said. "Your Grace," she said, "I need to tell you something, and I would ask you to let me finish before you respond." He set down the page he was holding. He waited. "My name is not Grant," she said. "It is Meredith Ashton. My father was Edmund Ashton, who owned Thornfield Grange for 32 years before his death. Rawdon Ashton is my first cousin, and he inherited everything from my father because the estate was entailed through the male line, and I had no legal claim on it." She paused. "The trust, however, is different. My grandfather established it specifically for female heirs. It was never part of the estate. Rawdon had no authority to offer it as collateral for any debt, and I believe, if you review the original trust documents, you will find that Prescott's claim is without legal standing." The Duke looked at her for a long moment. "How long have you been in this house?" he said. "As Miss Grant?" "8 days. And before that?" "I grew up here," she said. "I lived here until 14 months ago when Rawdon took possession." He stood up from the desk, not threateningly, simply the movement of a man who thought more clearly on his feet. He walked to the window and looked out at the dark and the distant line of the birch trees against a gray sky. "The glass house," he said. "The rose from Edinburgh, my mother's." He turned around. He was looking at her with an expression she could not quite read, which was unusual for her. She had spent years reading rooms, reading people, reading the particular quality of silence that preceded a decision. This was different. This was a man who had decided something and had not yet said it. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He went back to the desk and took Prescott's documents and set them to one side. He then opened the lower drawer of the desk. Her father's desk, she noted, still her father's desk in every grain of the wood, and took out a folder she did not recognize. He placed it in front of her. It contained a letter. She looked at it and then at him. "My solicitor found the original trust documents when reviewing the estate papers before purchase," he said. "He flagged them as unrelated to the sale. I reviewed them the evening I arrived, before Prescott appeared." He paused. "The trust is legally inviolable. I am aware of that." She looked at the documents. She looked at him. "You've known for days," she said. "I had a document that named an Ashton woman as beneficiary of an extant trust attached to this property," he said. And then, 3 days later, a new under-housekeeper arrived, who knew the name of every rose in the glass house, and moved through the upper corridor, as though she had walked it 10,000 times. He sat down. "I had some thoughts about that. Why didn't you say anything?" "Because," he said. And he was quiet for a moment, as though choosing with some care. "I wanted to understand what you were doing here. Whether you had come to cause difficulty about the sale, whether you were going to present a counterclaim to the estate itself." He looked at her steadily. "You haven't. The estate was legally his," she said. "Rawdon's, and then legally yours. Yes, I have no counterclaim. No. He looked at the trust documents. But you have this, and Prescott does not. She was quiet for a moment. What happens to Prescott? My solicitor will send him a letter, said the Duke, with a brevity that conveyed a great deal about the quality of his solicitor's letters and what it felt like to receive one. Meredith looked at her hands, which were, for the first time in a week, not entirely steady. I should have told you immediately. Yes, I told myself I only wanted to see the house once more before I changed it, he said. She looked up. I know what it is to have someone take a place you've spent your life in and then set about making it their own, he said. I grew up in my uncle's house after my parents died. He was not an unreasonable man, but he redecorated immediately and thoroughly, and there is something about that which is, he stopped. I am not planning to redecorate immediately and thoroughly. The estate will still be yours, she said. Yes. He leaned back slightly. That is not something I am going to change. She had expected to feel worse about hearing it stated plainly. She found instead that she felt something closer to relief, the particular relief of having a thing named clearly, after a long time of half-naming it. Mrs. Crowe, she said, her position. Mrs. Crowe is excellent at her job, he said. Mrs. Drummond was a temporary arrangement until the household was properly organized. And Tully. The head gardener. Yes, he stays. He paused. I had a conversation with him this morning about the camellia grafting. He's planning to try it on the jasmine in spring. She looked at him. He was not quite smiling. It was a very small alteration at the corner of his mouth, brief and then gone. But it was the first time she had seen anything like it in 9 days. And it changed something about the arrangement of his face in a way that was harder to look away from than she would have preferred. Miss Ashton, he said, what were you planning to do after you had seen the house? I don't know, she said, which was the first entirely honest thing she had said in 9 days. I think I had not entirely thought past arriving. He nodded, not unsympathetically. Where are you living? A lodging house in Halifax. And the trust funds. You are drawing on them? Rawdon told me they were tied up in the estate settlement, she said. I believed him. A pause. He lied, said the Duke of Carworth with a flatness that made it sound less like a judgment and more like a geological fact. You are entitled to draw on that trust immediately. My solicitor will communicate this to yours. I don't have a solicitor. You will have the use of mine for the purposes of establishing the trust's availability, he said, as it is connected to documents held in association with this estate. That is simply a practical matter. She thought about arguing that this was not simply a practical matter, that it was a considerable kindness dressed up in the language of administration. She thought about how much he would dislike her pointing that out. She said nothing. She stayed 3 more days, not as Miss Grant. She was introduced to Mrs. Drummond as herself, which Mrs. Drummond absorbed with a professionalism that Meredith suspected concealed approximately 45 minutes of intense private reckoning. She had meals in the small dining room, alone, except for the one evening when the Duke appeared in the doorway at 7 and looked at the table and then at her and said, with the air of a man solving a logistical problem, that it was impractical to lay 2 fires in 2 rooms when one would do. She agreed that this was impractical. They ate in a silence that was not uncomfortable. Not comfortable either, exactly, but alive with something that neither of them addressed directly. Because they were both, she had concluded, people who found it easier to address things indirectly until the thing became too plain to manage. On the second evening, he told her about the Thornfield drainage, which he had solved by means she found genuinely interesting, because she had spent half her adolescence watching Fitch struggle with the same problem unsuccessfully. On the third evening, she told him about the glass houses and her mother, carefully and without sentiment, just the facts of it. The rose, the cutting technique, the particular angle of winter light in the late afternoon that her mother had said was the best in the county. He listened the way he did everything, with his whole attention, not performing listening but actually doing it, as if what she was telling him was information he intended to keep. On the morning of the fourth day, she was going to leave. She had her trunk in the entrance hall, the servants' entrance, though he had said she was welcome to use the front door, which she couldn't quite bring herself to do, not with the new understanding of what side of the threshold she stood on. She was waiting for the carriage to be brought around. The morning was bright and very cold, and the birch trees were bare, and from the entrance hall she could see, through the east window, the line of the glass house roof catching the early light. He came down the stairs with his coat on and his working boots, which meant he had been going out to the north field. He stopped when he saw the trunk. They looked at each other for a moment. "The trust will be accessible by February at the latest," he said. "My solicitor is efficient." "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He picked up his hat from the table near the door. "The rose," he said, without looking at her. "The Edinburgh one. I should probably have the name written down properly for the records." A pause. "If you remember what the full variety is." "Maiden's Promise," she said. "The full name is Rosa Maiden's Promise, introduced in 1843. It was developed by a nursery in Perthshire." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll come to Halifax," he said. She looked at him. "Not immediately," he said, still not looking at her, in the tone of a man announcing a change to an estate drainage plan. "I have things to attend to here first. The North Field, the tenant agreements, the glass house records need to be properly maintained." He put his hat on. "But I'll come. To deliver the trust documents," she said. "If you like," he said. She looked at the window and the light on the glass house roof, and thought about the rose and her mother, and the particular shape of loss. How it was not always a diminishing, but sometimes an alteration, a change in the form of a thing rather than the end of it. "All right," she said. The carriage came around the corner of the dairy, and the driver climbed down, and Meredith Ashton picked up her smaller bag and walked out of Thornfield Grange through the servants' entrance for the last time. At the corner of the birch trees she did not look back. She didn't need to.